Case File Number 006. Classification: Historical and Psychological Phenomenon. Subject: Documented paranormal encounters from 0 AD to the early medieval period. Between the end of the ancient world and the rise of the medieval era, there exists a period of time often overlooked. A transition between belief systems, between explanations, between what people thought they understood and what they could not explain. During this period, accounts began to appear, not as myth, but as record. Descriptions of encounters with things that should not have been present. Figures seen after death. Voices heard without source. Locations abandoned because something remained. These accounts were not written as fiction. They were documented as events. Events that were observed, experienced, and in many cases, feared. Unlike earlier civilizations, these encounters were no longer explained through complex pantheons. They were interpreted through a different lens, one of morality, judgment, and the possibility that not all things rested after death. This case file examines a series of recorded encounters spanning from the early centuries after 0 AD through the Viking Age and into the early medieval world. The objective is not to determine what was seen, but to understand why these experiences appear consistently across time, across cultures, across belief systems, and why they never fully disappear. As the ancient world began to change, so did the way people interpreted what they experienced. The events themselves did not disappear. People still reported seeing things, hearing and feeling things they could not explain. But the explanation began to shift, because by the 2nd and 3rd centuries, a new framework was taking hold. One that no longer relied on multiple forces, sources, and possibilities. It simplified the unknown into something else entirely. One of the earliest recorded examples of this shift appears in early Christian writings. Accounts of individuals who claimed to experience what they described as disturbances. Not always visible, but undeniable. Voices, movements, a sense that something was present when nothing should have been. In many of these accounts, the response was not fear alone. It was interpretation. These experiences were no longer seen as random. Rather, they were seen as meaningful, as tests, or as warnings. One figure often associated with these early accounts is Athanasius of Alexandria. In his writings, he describes the life of a man who withdrew from society, not into comfort, but into isolation, into the desert, where the environment itself offered no distraction or interruption, only silence. With that silence, experiences began. Not necessarily consistent, not predictable, but persistent enough. Sounds without source, movements in empty space, and the overwhelming sense that something was present, watching, interacting, responding. These accounts were recorded not as imagination, but as encounters, real encounters. And the interpretation of it was immediate. These were not neutral experiences. They were confrontations between the individual and something unseen. From a psychological perspective, this environment is important. Isolation, silence, sensory deprivation. These conditions are known to affect perception, to heighten awareness, to amplify internal processes, which can create the experience of something external, something separate, something real. But here's where it becomes more complex, because the people documenting these events were not unaware. They did not lack intelligence, and they certainly did not lack reasoning. And yet, they did not question whether something was happening. They questioned what it meant, why it was happening, and what it required of them. This is the shift, not from experience, but from explanation. The unknown was no longer something to simply observe. It became something to interpret, something that carried intention, purpose, and consequence. And as we move forward into the centuries that follow, these experiences do not fade. They become more detailed and more specific. In some cases, more physical. As written accounts become more consistent, something else begins to appear. Not just presences or sounds, but forms, descriptions of things that were seen clearly, repeatedly, and often by more than one person. One of the earliest figures to document these kinds of encounters was Gregory the Great. Writing in the late 6th century, Gregory the Great recorded a collection of accounts now known as dialogues. In several of these accounts, individuals describe encounters not with human figures, but with animals, appearing suddenly and disappearing just as quickly. In multiple early accounts, there is a specific detail that repeats. A dark animal, usually described as a dog, but larger, standing just beyond reach. Not approaching, not retreating, watching. In one recorded account, a traveler reports encountering this figure on an otherwise empty road. At first, it appears ordinary, a stray animal, nothing unusual. But it doesn't move, nor does it react. And it doesn't behave like something alive. And as the distance closes, something becomes clear. Its size is wrong, and its eyes reflect light where there is none. In one account, a monk reports seeing such a figure repeatedly, not attacking, not approaching, but observing, and always at a distance, always present when he was alone. From a modern perspective, this raises immediate questions, because the human brain is highly responsive to animal forms, especially in low visibility and in isolation. Shapes become recognizable. Presence becomes assumed. This is a survival mechanism. The brain prefers to misidentify something as alive, rather than miss something that is. But these accounts go further, because the descriptions remain consistent across individuals and across locations. Dark animal forms, watching, following, appearing at specific moments, often tied to emotional or physical vulnerability. Within the belief system of the time, these were not considered natural animals. They were interpreted as something else, something capable of taking form, of appearing in a way that could be recognized, but not understood. As we move forward into the later centuries, these encounters become even more defined, more physical, aggressive, and in some cases, impossible to ignore. By the time we reach the 8th century, the nature of these encounters changes again. They are no longer distant. They are no longer passive. They begin to interact. In early medieval Europe, particularly in regions that would later be associated with the Viking expansion, written accounts begin to describe something different. Creatures with form, with impact. In several early records, including monastic writings and regional accounts, there are descriptions of disturbances tied not to individuals but to places, specifically isolated locations such as farms, outbuildings, and the edges of settlements. The pattern is consistent, as it begins with animals, such as livestock behaving differently, perhaps even acting agitated, refusing to enter certain areas, and reacting to something that cannot be seen. And then, the sightings. Brief, too large, and too still, or moving in a way that doesn't align with what it appears to be. By late antiquity, the dragon was already becoming one of the most recognizable creatures across Eurasia. In Roman and early medieval accounts, dragons were often described less like modern fantasy beasts and more like enormous serpents, symbols of chaos, danger, and untamed nature. In the collapsing Roman world, dragons were sometimes associated with invading forces or distant, unexplored lands. The dragon was never just one idea. It was a projection of instability itself. When civilization felt fragile, the dragon represented everything beyond its borders. Long before the medieval era fully formed, the griffin had already traveled through Persian, Greek, and Roman storytelling. With the body of a lion and the wings and head of an eagle, it combined two apex predators into a single symbol of dominance. In Roman-era natural histories, griffins were said to guard gold in remote mountain regions, places where human civilization ended. The griffin represented protection, vigilance, and divine authority. But psychologically, it also reflects something deeper: the desire to believe that power and wealth are guarded by forces greater than humanity itself. By the early Roman Empire and into medieval Europe, one of the most feared creatures in folklore emerged: the basilisk. Described as the king of serpents, it was said to kill with a single look, poison the air with its breath, and leave the land itself dead and barren. Some later medieval interpretations even claimed it was born from a corrupted egg, an omen of unnatural creation. The basilisk embodies a very specific fear of the ancient world: invisible death, disease, poison, air that cannot be trusted, things you cannot fight, only survive. Not all creatures were symbols of fear, however. Some were symbols of hope. The phoenix appears in Egyptian-influenced Greek and Roman writings as a radiant bird that lives for centuries before burning itself and rising again from the ashes. By late antiquity, early Christian writers even reinterpreted it as a symbol of resurrection and eternal renewal. The phoenix represents one of humanity's most powerful ideas: that destruction is not always an ending. Sometimes it is transformation. In Greek and Roman natural histories, especially texts influenced by Persian storytelling, travelers spoke of a terrifying creature from distant lands: the manticore. It was described as having the body of a lion, a human-like face, and a tail tipped with venomous spines. It was said to be fast, intelligent, and extremely dangerous, lurking in unknown deserts beyond the edges of the known world. The manticore was essentially the ancient world's way of saying, there are places where reality stops making sense. In Greek mythology that persisted into Roman retellings, harpies were winged spirits associated with sudden disappearance and violent wind. They were often described as stealing people away or punishing the wicked by dragging them into storms. Over time, they became symbols of uncontrollable natural forces, especially storms and destruction at sea. The harpy reflects how ancient people explain sudden loss. One moment something is there, the next it is gone. By late antiquity, especially in Greco-Roman folklore, the lamia became a figure of deep psychological horror. Often described as a beautiful woman cursed into a monstrous form, she was said to prey on children or young men, depending on the version. She blended beauty with danger, trust with destruction. The lamia represents a fear that is less physical and more emotional. The idea that something familiar can become something unrecognizable. By the early medieval period, The basilisk legend evolved into something even stranger: the cockatrice. A creature said to be born from a rooster's egg incubated by a serpent, it carried the same deadly gaze and poisonous breath as its predecessor. But it also reflected medieval thinking about corruption, how unnatural combinations produce unnatural consequences. The cockatrice is what happens when fear evolves over time. It becomes more detailed, more symbolic, and more terrifying. Across this entire stretch of history, from Rome's Golden Age to the early medieval world, these creatures stayed alive in human imagination. Dragons, griffins, basilisks, phoenixes, manticores, harpies, lamias, cockatrices. They were never random inventions. Rather, they were explanations for disease, for storms, for death, for transformation, and for everything humanity could not yet understand. Even today, they survive, not in forests or deserts, but in stories, films, and our collective imagination. Because in the end, we never stopped creating monsters. We just changed the language we use to describe them. From a psychological standpoint, this is where multiple factors begin to overlap. Low light conditions, heightened awareness, isolation, all of which can influence perception, all of which can distort size, movement, and even intent. But there's a complication to this. These accounts are not singular. They are consistently repeated, which introduces a different possibility. This is not just misinterpretation, but shared pattern recognition. In some reports, the interaction becomes direct. There are structures that are damaged and doors that are forced open, barriers that are disturbed, not destroyed immediately, but altered, as if something tested them. And in a few cases, there are descriptions of proximity, not necessarily visual, but physical, the sense of something moving nearby with enough presence to be felt. This introduces a different layer, not because the human brain is not only capable of detecting visual patterns, but it is highly sensitive to movement in space, vibrations, shifts in pressure, subtle environmental changes, all of which can create the perception of something being close even when nothing is visible. These experiences were interpreted as intrusion, as something crossing into a space where it did not belong, and it was something that needed to be addressed, not ignored. And that response is what separates this period from those before it, because now people begin to act. Locations are abandoned. Spaces are avoided. And in some cases, efforts are made to confront what is believed to be there. By the time we reach the later part of this period, these encounters are no longer questioned. They are expected, accounted for, even integrated into daily life. Not because they were understood, but because they were misunderstood. By the time we reach the later part of the early medieval period, Something subtle but important has changed. People are no longer just reacting to these encounters, they are anticipating them, adjusting for them, and even living around them. In multiple regional accounts, particularly in Northern and Western Europe, patterns begin to appear, not just in what people claim to see, but in how they behave, where they go, where they don't go, what they avoid. Certain areas become known, not officially or documented as law, but understood. Edges of forests, abandoned structures, and open land far from other people. Places where encounters were more likely to occur. And over time, people begin to adapt. They travel in groups. They avoid certain paths after dark. They keep distance from locations with repeated reports. Not because they've all experienced something themselves, but because enough people have. And this is where psychology becomes critical. Because humans are highly responsive to shared information, especially when that information involves a potential threat. We don't need direct experience to change our behavior. We need patterns and repetition, consistency in what others report. And during this period, those patterns are clear. Encounters happen more frequently in isolation, in environments where the brain has less information to work with, which creates a very specific condition. The brain begins to fill in the gaps, not randomly, but predictively, based on what it has learned and what it has heard, what it expects. And once expectation is established, perception follows. Shapes become clearer. Movement becomes intentional. And presence becomes assumed. But here's where it becomes more complex. Because not every account fits that pattern. Not every encounter happens in darkness. And not every experience occurs in isolation. And not every individual reporting these events was expecting them. Within the belief system of the time, this distinction mattered because if something appeared without expectation or without environment to explain it, then it could not be dismissed as perception alone. It required a different explanation, one that involved intention, presence, and meaning. Across these centuries, the details change. The locations, the descriptions, the forms, but the pattern remains the same. Something is seen, something is heard, something is felt, and it is interpreted. Either the human brain is remarkably consistent in the way it interprets the unknown, or people were responding to something that has never been fully explained. Within the early Christian perspective, this question had an answer. These experiences were not meaningless. Moments where the physical world and something beyond it briefly overlapped. And whether that explanation is accepted or not, the pattern remains. Across history, people experience things they cannot fully explain, and they create meaning to make sense of it. Sometimes that meaning becomes belief. Sometimes it becomes fear. And sometimes it becomes something that stays with them long after the experience ends, even when nothing is there. Next week, we're going deeper because not all encounters were distant. Not all were unclear. Some were direct, repeated, and impossible to ignore. If you like this episode of the Cryptic Mind podcast, please like, follow, subscribe, and comment wherever you are listening. I'll see you next week.